Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Down to Earth series of talks. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We shall talk about science today. Science is the great antidote to religion these days. We constantly see this conflict between religion, which is perceived to be superstitious, and science, which is perceived to be factual. And I think we need to dispel that myth. Science, of course, comes from the Latin word that means to know, knowledge. Science really is the quest for knowledge. What knowledge? To find out facts, to find the truth. But science has given up trying to find the truth and has become a religion, a secular religion in its own right. Because it only accepts certain truths and not others. The scientific method, of course, if we talk about methodology, is something that the West learned from Muslims. Muslims developed medicine, astronomy, geography, the various sciences that were necessary in order to understand life and deal with life. In order to pray regularly, you needed to be able to calculate the times of prayer. In order to navigate, you needed to know where the stars were, and so on and so forth. And that Muslim science was always a way of serving a greater purpose, be it serving Allah, like if you need to pray, or serving humanity, like you practice medicine. Science had a purpose that lay beyond it. It was not a purpose in itself. And science knew its place in that it only was able to deal with this world, with the empirical knowledge, and did not touch upon the revelation. Of course, Muslims also developed great spiritual sciences, the science of ulumul Quran, the science of tafsir, the science of hadith, the categorization, the classification of hadith and so on. These are sciences. But it was always understood that there is a supreme knowledge. Like Allah says in the Quran, above anybody who knows anything is somebody who knows more. And ultimately Allah knows all. So knowledge had stages. And revelation was the highest stage of knowledge. And below that, science knew that empirical knowledge only helps us to understand revelation. You can never replace it. When Western nations picked up the scientific knowledge advances from the Muslims, they had the dilemma that they were in a society that was dominated by the church, and the church had a completely different approach to life than the Quran did. The church by then no longer relied on scripture but on dogma. Dogma is prescriptive. You mustn't question it. Whether it's right or wrong really doesn't come into the equation. Whether it's borne out by fact or not doesn't come into the equation. It is pronounced by a higher authority and you have to unquestionably accept it and believe in it. The Quran does not tell us to have this sort of blind faith. The Quran tells us to travel in the earth and find out. The Quran tells us to seek knowledge. The Prophet ﷺ tells us to seek knowledge. The quest for knowledge is inherent in the Quran. Whereas in the Bible, knowledge is the forbidden fruit. Knowledge is what destroys people. The misconception in Christianity is that Adam ate from the tree of knowledge after Eve tempted him. So woman is temptation, woman is evil, knowledge is bad. It's a different approach. And so science now, which evidently brought results, for example in medicine, brought cure, science now pitted itself against religion. And so science and religion no longer work together, but against each other. Now we come full circle and Muslims arrive in the West, and the West is dominant through the scientific method, through technology. And suddenly this old battle between science and religion is turned against Islam, as if Islam is also a dogmatic religion like Christianity, and if it's incompatible with science. And in return, Muslims go to quite some lengths to try and prove that they are scientific. There has been a whole movement of what they call the Islamization of knowledge, where they took findings from science and try to prove that the Quran says the same thing. And here we have a dilemma, because now science becomes the yardstick, and we see if the Quran fits in, and we can interpret in a way that it fits in, rather than the Quran being the yardstick, and we see if the science is sound or not, dependent on whether it agrees with the divine knowledge or not. That's not the same, it's the exact opposite. The problem with science is that a lot of its theories or assumptions or conjectures are actually to the general public sold as if they were pure facts and reality. But they are not. They are attempts at explaining the world, but they're not facts. Furthermore, science is limited to the realm of the material world and to that which is accessible to our senses, empirical knowledge, what we can experience. But that is not all knowledge there is. For example, on the question of the existence of God, science has nothing to say. Science can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God, because that realm is outside our experience. God is not from amongst us. We do not know, we did not self-create, we don't know how we came about. Science has some attempted explanations. We did not witness, we cannot experience the creation of the universe. We know nothing about what came before us and what lies beyond us. Science is unable to explain what is not accessible to us through our senses. Therefore, science can neither prove nor disprove. Yet, science, because of this conflict with religion, prefers to come onto the side of disproving and say it doesn't exist. Because I can't prove it exists, it doesn't exist. Yet you can't prove that it doesn't exist either. So you should have a neutral stance. Science has lost its neutral stance on that. Now, if we look into philosophy, which is also a science, one of the human sciences, one of the greatest philosophers of the Western age was Immanuel Kant. Incidentally, when he lived at the time in Prussia, which is now Germany, under Frederick the Great, it was fashionable in those days to discover Islamic concepts. And for that reason, you find that the PhD certificate of Immanuel Kant actually has in Arabic the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the Bismillah formula in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Mercy-Giving, written at the top, rather than the usual Trinity formula that you would have on those documents. It is quite interesting. Now this philosopher, if you look at his treatise on reason, pure reason, and then he follows it up, practical reason, which means applied reason, and so on, he comes to the conclusion that whilst you cannot prove the existence of God, you can prove the necessity for the existence of God. Because since we are not the creators of ourselves, nor the creators of the world which we inhabit, therefore it must be something beyond our original cause must lie outside of us and our world. And if it's outside of us and our world, it must be superior to us, or at least different to us. It will not be like us. It will not be the same. And we are unable to access it, so we can't prove it. But it makes more sense for there to be an external cause than it makes sense for there not to be an external cause. Modern science, however, rejects this kind of philosophy and goes with Friedrich Nietzsche, another German philosopher, who in a way wants to be, well, there is only the material world, nothing else exists. And within that material world, man will evolve into becoming a god. This is Nietzsche's, the superhuman, Nietzsche's philosophy, which even today you find in computing technology. There is a lot of things people don't realize, that we use symbolism. For example, the Apple computer uses an apple with a bite taken out. The forbidden apple, the rebellion. This is the fruit of knowledge we should use, even so God forbids it. So this and many other symbols, I could talk about symbolism, but there isn't a lot of time. In the old days, people understood the meaning of geometry. Geometry had meaning. Numbers had meaning. When Allah says that 8 angels carry His throne, that means His throne is a level above the lower realm, because 7 is infinite. Thereafter 8 starts a new cadence. You have it in music, you have a scale of 8. You also have it in geometry. Now, for example, the Islamic Star, that represents in a way the Kaaba, is an 8-pointed star. It provides security. And you see it nowadays as a symbol of the fire brigade. It's a protective symbol. Instead, on Muslim flags of Muslim countries, be it, Morocco or any other, you have the pentagram, the 5-pointed star, the star of the magician, by which they bind people. So we've been colonized, even in our flags and the symbolism that we think is Islamic. And we also have, interestingly, the crescent in many of these flags, like in Turkey. It is the waning crescent, not the increasing one. So it doesn't grow, it decreases. We're in the decline, according to those flags. But symbolism aside, science has aligned with pure materialism and the rejection of belief, rather than working with faith. And it has become a religion, and a very intolerant religion at that, where its theories suddenly become dogma. Take the theory of evolution. Evolution means that life evolves from a lower to a higher stage. Or simply that life mutates. Now, of course, within a given species, it is true that life mutates. You can breed plants or animals to have certain characteristics by selective breeding. But evolution actually says that all life evolved from the lowest life form in some primordial soup that was cooked up, through some accidental events, and then gradually evolved into higher life forms. And it started in the sea and gradually moved out of the sea onto the land, and then they learned to fly. Of course, this is mythology, this is not science. The odds are proven to be impossible. Because if, let's say, a land animal needed to grow wings in order to fly, and by accident it mutated, but couldn't fly yet, the primitive form of the animal that is not adapted to flight would not survive. It would, in survival of the fittest, simply be eradicated, because it can neither walk nor fly properly anymore. If you look at any creature, from the smallest to the biggest, you find that it is perfectly designed and adapted to its environment. This doesn't happen by chance, mutations and accidents. That only happens by design. If I build a structure, if I build a sand castle, then there is design in it. I have to put an effort in it to make something meaningful. By the passage of time, it will flatten into nothingness. The rock will become sand. Everything will be level. Disorder happens by itself. Order only happens by design. The so-called evidence, what is called the missing link, those creatures in between the former state and the new state that turned the fish into mammals on land and turn land animals into birds, don't exist, have never been found. There were some that turned out to be fakes, that people pretended they existed to make themselves a name. But what we have found are fossils of animals that over millennium of years, or however long it was, were exactly like what we have today still. Some are extinct, but those that are still are there, they are exactly the same. They have not changed. But the theory of evolution as a sort of mythology of creation, of being able to do away with God and say it just happened, there is no God, that theory is now taught as dogma and you mustn't challenge it. It has never been proven. Because the theory of evolution is political. It means that, firstly, we are only animals. A way with Allah has imbued human beings with dignity and put them above the animals. No, we are just yet another animal. And therefore, we can live like an animal. Our material existence is all there is. But of course, if we do that, we live worse than animals. Because for animals, their design is that they live like animals. For us, is that we raise ourselves above our material nature and aspire to our spiritual nature. Because besides giving us a physical existence, Allah has also given us some of His Spirit that He breathed into us. So we have that divine spark in us, and if we neglect that, we're not just animals, but as Allah says in the Quran, we are worse. If eating and drinking and procreating and having fun is what we want to do, we are worse. The theory of evolution tells us that everything gets better all the time, evolves into higher life forms, and we are at the top. And it was a theory, Darwinism, that was espoused by colonial Europe because it allowed them to conquer the lesser nations that were not yet evolved as far. You could enslave the Africans because they hadn't evolved to that high level of the Europeans Darwin wrote about. So there is a political element to it. We have these concepts in a lot of things. For example, all devil worship is essentially sun worship, because the devil is created from fire. We are created from the earth. According to our theology, the earth is not just some rock floating in space and there are millions like it. We just haven't discovered them. No, the earth is special. Allah created the earth as the perfect habitat for us, to send us here for our journey of trial to regain lost paradise. So the earth is the center. For us, the earth is special. And if you look at science, true pseudo-science can tell you that the Earth is tilted in a certain way, the Earth is protected with an atmosphere in a certain way against cosmic rays. The Earth is such that it's livable, which the odds are all against that. It is not normal, but the Earth is special. And everything else is there to make the Earth special and to make us special. So we are the pinnacle of creation. Not some evolved animal, but the pinnacle of creation in a very special place where Allah looks after us. Yet science says the Earth is just another planet, the Sun is the center of our universe, and the Sun is most important. And there are many others like that. So the Sun worship, the heliocentricity, doesn't just have to do with science. It has to do again with the old pagan mythology of worshipping the sun, the stars, the light. Lucifer, the light, yes, the name given to the devil, Lucifer, the light. And if you look at many scientific publications, if you look at many of those people who worked for the advancement of science, you find that they are influenced by those thoughts, that they give their publication those names. Ordinary people are simply not aware of that they use these symbolisms. Why do we have obelisks in every place of import of the old Egyptian religion? Why do we have all these symbols that relate to pagan and devil worship? And then we call it science, when it is superstition. For us Muslims, we need to first of all reaffirm that the Quran is our primary source of knowledge. It is our yardstick, our reference. If something does not agree with the Quran, there is a mistake. The science is mistaken. We cannot simply say, oh well, yeah, we need to reinterpret it such that it fits the bill. Secondly, we need to use science as a tool, not as a religion, not as a dogma. It is a useful tool to achieve a given purpose. It is not a purpose in itself. It certainly isn't a replacement religion, but that is what it has become. Talking about evolution again, even the mathematics of science tell us that it is impossible. For certain things to happen by chance, the odds of it happening are so great, and it having to be happening again and again and again, so that some intelligent life. I mean, if I told you that I have a garage in which over the last 20 years I just dumped everything I didn't need. Nuts, bolts, screws, paper, a bit of oil, old engine oil, even a steering wheel, you know, I put all kinds of stuff in there. And then I walked away and never looked at it again, and 20 years later, I opened the garage door and would you believe it? There was a proper car in there. And when I turned the ignition, it started up, you could drive it, amazing. It just happened by chance, by itself. These parts just managed to put themselves together in some meaningful order. And you would say, lunatic, send him off to the asylum. Rightly so. Most of these evolutionary scientists should be sent off to the asylum. Because it doesn't happen that you have some, primordial soup and this and that, and suddenly, bingo, there is man with all his intelligence, crawled out of the sea like a worm initially and became a bird, and now great relative of the whale. It doesn't happen. For it to happen, you wait an eternity and another eternity and another eternity, and it still won't happen by chance. Anything that has an ordered structure and is functional requires purposeful design and construction. It doesn't happen by itself. The disorder gets greater. Yes, if I open the garage door and find that all my parts are covered in spider webs, yes, that happens. Or that they've rusted and I can't use them anymore, that happens. but that they assemble themselves into even something as simple as, well, a little push trolley. That doesn't happen. Never mind a car, never mind a robot, never mind a human being, it doesn't happen. Life did not come about by itself. We did not create ourselves. We cannot create life. Even now we can manipulate. We have gene manipulation, we have experiments, genetic modification, but we cannot create life out of nothing. There is no scientist who is able to create anything new. We can only work with which Allah has already given us. We can turn it into something else. We can copy it, reproduce it, clone it even. But we cannot create even a fly out of nothing, like Allah challenges us in the Quran. We are unable to do that. Because even a fly, even a mosquito, is in itself perfectly created and adapted for its purpose. It lacks nothing. It is not an accident. And even talking about the flies and the mosquitoes, it is interesting because in this idea that the reptile became a bird and gradually evolved into flying. Well, that reptile all that time already lived on mosquitoes and flying insects. How did they evolve to sustain that reptile if it happened like that through mutation? They were there. They were there shaped perfectly. They didn't evolve from some sort of non-flying mosquito that suddenly took to the air and thought, ooh, I can do it. The problem is that we are in awe of science because science has mastered the use of technology. But the use of technology does not necessarily imply that the underlying concepts are correct or factually correct. For example, before we knew that the earth is round, and Muslims were amongst the early people to discover that, but before we knew that the earth is round, the church insisted on that the earth is flat. Prior to Copernicus, that was the dogma, and you got done for saying otherwise. Yet they had a complicated system of navigation and understanding the stars and what is where, that on that basis worked. You can have technology, workable technology, and produce results, and yet some of your fundamental basic assumption can be entirely wrong. They had the Ptolemaic tables to understand the movements of stars. Today we know it was all wrong, but it worked. Their assumptions, their foundation, their understanding was wrong. Yet they had the technology to deal with the problems of their day. They didn't get lost at sea. Even so, they thought the earth was flat. They still didn't get lost at sea. They still understood the stars in a different way. So the technology alone is no proof of truth. So let's talk about the truth a little bit before we close. The truth is absolute and undividable. Science, on the other hand, the fanatical secular religious science, tells us that everything is relative. And I'm not just talking about the theory of relativism. They talk about everything being relative, and these days they even talk about parallel universe and everything, being possible. It's a bit like the reincarnation. You can do it over and over again and try it a little bit different. The truth, it's like this story they tell you in I think Buddhism, that there were, 7 wise men blindfolded being led to an elephant, and to tell what animal it is, one touched the trunk and said it's a snake, one touched the leg and said it's a tree, one touched the tail and said it's a snake, it's a whatever. You get the gist of the story. one touched the ear, and so they all come up with different answers of what kind of animal it is. Whereas, of course, it's an elephant. And so the lesson, the so-called morale, is that there are different perspectives, different aspects, different ways of seeing the truth, and they were all right. But the truth is that they were all wrong. The truth is that there are not many different ways of seeing the truth. The fact is they only saw part of the truth. And all they had to do to see the whole truth is take their blindfolds off. So those wise men were actually quite stupid. So science tells us this story and other stories likewise to make us believe that there can be multiple truths, that this can be true, but that can also be true, and something else likewise. But this is not so. There can only be one truth, and there can be misunderstood truths. There can be incomplete truths. There can be people who have only seen one side of the story. But when it comes to the whole story, the truth is undividable. An elephant is more than just an accumulation of his parts. A trunk and a leg and an ear and a tail do not make an elephant. These are qualitatively different. And this is what happens in analytical thinking in science, that instead of a holistic view of the world, everything gets dissected and put into its parts as if the sum total of these parts would make the whole. But it doesn't make the whole. Because the whole has something that binds it together that the parts on their own don't have. We see this in pharmaceutical medicine, for example. A plant has a certain effect. If we extract something from that plant, it also has an effect. But it doesn't have the same effect because the composition has changed. For example, if you take sugar cane and make it into a drink, you can drink one glass and you feel sick if you want more. But if you extract the white powder that is sugar, you can fill your cup with it. And you get diabetes eventually. Because it is no longer in a composition that we can take to. So science has done a lot of taking apart, putting back together, dissecting, recombining, and misses the essence. The essence that any being, any living being, any plant, any animal, and ourselves are more than just the sum total of our components. There is a ruh in us, there is a spirit in us. And if that's gone, our components will simply disintegrate. Science cannot answer the question of life and death, because the question of life and death is outside the realm of empirical science. Scientists cannot talk to the dead to find out. So there are limitations, and the arrogance of modern day science is that they do not admit their limitations. They give the impression that they can have the answers to everything. But the answers to everything can only be found in revelation. Allah is the only one who knows everything, and His book is the only book that tells us about everything as much as He wants us to know. So for Muslims, we need to get back to using science as a tool, not as a religion, not as a dogma, not as a replacement for faith. And we need to be very careful about this relativism, that there are multiple truths, that there is different ways of looking at it, that everybody is right in their own way. Because if somebody is right, if something is right, the opposite cannot also be right. It is wrong or false. This great leveling of this dividing of diluting of the truth is something that does a lot of damage. It poisons the mind, and our children are brought up with this understanding, and it is quite easy to see why they live, you would almost say, schizophrenic lives, where they are Muslim in one part of life and non-Muslim elsewhere, where in the world where they have to compete, in a world where they have to achieve, they choose the non-Muslim way. And then, because they feel guilty to placate their soul, they go to the mosque or they do their prayers and choose the Muslim way as an implant on top of it. Islam and science as a religion are not compatible. Islam and science as a method are. And we need to clearly distinguish the two. I hope that is another concept that is a little bit clearer understood. There is an awful lot that could be said about it, but there is always a limitation of time. So for now, Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.